Okay, guys, so I again want to talk about how screwed the Democrats are. Now, if you're not aware, a lot of the problems that are coming from the Democrat side of the aisle is that they really have no direction. They have made a lot of stupid decisions and forced down a lot of their most prominent politicians, which allowed more extreme ideals to come to the forefront. A lot of the communists and socialists in the party have started to become more and more emboldened. They were vastly supported by the people that have joined, like Antifa, for example, or for like BLM. Now, for Black Lives Matters, they come from a history of the Black Panther parties. Now, there's still a few versions of the Black Panthers around, and in the past, they were a socialist group, and in fact had many historical incidents where they were, well, let's just say that they were not a very friendly group of people, like doing stuff like kidnapping and murder in some cases. Now, the Black Panthers came from the idea that black people were being suppressed, and that was true for quite a while, especially in the 50s and 60s. And then when the civil rights movement had started, these organizations formed around socialist groups, partially due to Soviet and Chinese intervention, but that wasn't the only influences upon them. Well, nowadays, BLM comes from that, and the current leaders of BLM just basically abuse the system, taking in a whole bunch of donations and using it to enrich themselves and their relatives, and buying mansions and paying themselves huge stipends and paychecks. It was absolutely crazy what had happened, and that's why BLM is no longer as prominent as it used to be. But BLM was actually formed under Obama, due to the fact that Obama promised change and brought none. In fact, expanding the wars and expanding the bombings and the interference with outside governments, causing disillusionment among many people. Well, one of the reasons that is one of the reasons the Democrats are doing so bad. But another reason why the Democrats are doing so bad is because of how hypocritical they are. For example, 10, 20 years ago, you would have Nancy Pelosi making speeches on how the government is very inefficient and how they were not, they were people abusing the system and how much fraud and waste there were. While those clips have been played more and more online, people see that the Democrats used to believe the exact same thing that Trump is currently doing. And you can imagine how it's getting distracted by my glasses reflecting my phone in there. But you can imagine that as people see more and more of these videos on the Democrats espousing the same exact beliefs and ideology of Trump, people look at this and just realize just how insane things have gotten. There's also a bunch of different issues with the Democrat Party, but one of them is, for example, that they don't really have a leader right now. The people that they chose to lead the party have absolutely failed to make any difference. Well, while Obama was a huge proponent of change, he never actually offered any. He actually was more of the same for many of the Democrats. So the fact of the matter is that people don't trust him anymore, especially after he endorsed Kamala Harris and said that any black person, any black man who doesn't support her uh, is working against their own race. Well, his influence had very little impact on the 2024 election, causing him to be, well, disregarded as a viable leader of the party. Despite all the jokes that were saying that he was basically the one puppeting on Joe Biden, it doesn't seem like he has as much influence as he used to. Which, I mean, sad for him, but, I mean, when you offer exactly nothing alternative or anything that can improve people's lives, well, people are just going to stop listening to you. Now, there are not studies, there are books that have been coming out showing that behind the scenes during the 2024 election, Obama didn't think that Kamala Harris could win, and he was actually really upset with Joe Biden for endorsing her. Whereas Joe Biden endorsing her might have been a big middle finger to the establishment, as they had been the ones to throw him out of the election when he thought he could still win. And this despite the fact that he knew for at least 5 years that he had had prostate cancer and he had been deteriorating mentally. This was something that was very obvious throughout his 4 years, which the media tried to suppress and say that they were cheap fakes for such a long time. The whole thing with Biden and Obama is also pretty crazy. Given that Biden was a huge opponent to integration back in the day, he said specifically that he believed that his family would be growing up in a racial jungle if they integrated and allowed busing to be like integrated. Now, I have talked about this before, but the whole thing behind that too is very polarizing. Now, I've talked to my mom and I asked her especially like about Detroit and how it fell. And I had mentioned that a huge problem with Detroit is that a lot of people had rioted back in the 70s or so. And this caused a lot of people to start fleeing the city because of how dangerous it had gotten. There was a huge meme at the time, basically, that the National Guard and the police had been talking about snipers. And they had started to shoot at anybody that was in like a position that they thought that they would be sniping from. Leading to at least 3 innocent people being killed, including a visitor that was from out of town. Now, the riots only lasted like 6 days, but the main reason why a lot of people left the city wasn't because of that. My mom told me that one of the reasons people had left was because of busing. Now, I was kind of confused at first, but she explained it had nothing to do with race. The problem was they wanted to integrate all the schools, but they didn't take into account where all the schools were located and where the families were from. What they would do is they would take people from one side of the city and start and tell them that they had to go to school in a completely different district. Now, if you don't know, Detroit is relatively a huge city. It can take you an hour to drive from one end to another depending on traffic. So somebody from the north side may be forced to go to a school on the south side with no regards to how parents have to travel back and forth between work. That means that after school that these kids would have to be waiting in a strange neighborhood far away from home, waiting for a bus to pick them up, long before cell phones were a thing. This made a lot of parents nervous just because these neighborhoods weren't always safe. And even if they were, what happens if the kid missed the bus? How would they be able to get home? How would they be able to tell their parents that they need a ride? How would the parents even get there to give them a ride? The logistical problems of the whole situation caused a lot of people to realize that this whole system was borked and that they had to get out of the city because they wanted school choice. If they couldn't, and even if they couldn't choose their own schools, they would at least want their kids to be going to a place that was local, not a place that was halfway across the city, far away from wherever their place of business was or wherever their place of employment was. Now, the other issue with the Democrats, well, anyways, let's get on with Detroit real quick. This meant that a lot of people who had the money to do so left the city. A lot of people, like the Fords, for example, lived in the Grosse Points, and any other people that could afford to move there did so. And the Grosse Points became some of the richest neighborhoods in the entire city. In fact, they have become so culturally different that a lot of the people in Grosse Pointe have actually talked about leaving Wayne County and joining Macomb County. Now, there are a few other well-off neighborhoods in and around Detroit in the many cities that exist there. This has left a lot of people who have only ever voted for Democrat being in the city. Since it's a predominantly black city and a lot of black people, they vote for Democrats like 93% of the time. Now, there's a whole host of reasons for it, and I've already talked about the Great Society formed after JFK was uh, assassinated, which I brought up in other videos, which is something that you should look into. Basically, they have destroyed the black family, meaning that a lot of black families are now reliant on the government to take care of them since a lot of fathers are no longer at the home. And it started to enact policies that meant that if a mother was single and had to raise her own children, the government would pay a bunch of stipends in order to encourage, help the families, but it actually encouraged mothers to be single, meaning that there was no father figure in the house, and this led to higher crimes because there's no one. Well, fathers are more likely to discipline their children and make sure that they don't do anything too silly. Anyways, it's a whole host of things. There's also an issue with the Democrats where a lot of people have been trying to leave Democrat strongholds like California. Now, there have been talks, and there have been two different proposals in California to actually break the state up. The first proposal was to have the state broken up into 5 different pieces, meaning 4 different states would be created from this union. This dissolution of the state. This proposal went to the Supreme Court of California and was rejected. It was not allowed to be even put on the ballot, meaning that people wouldn't even be allowed to make their own choice in this matter. They were so afraid that this proposal could even pass that they didn't even allow the people to choose for themselves what they wanted. After that, another proposal was made to instead break the state up into 3 pieces. Again, it went to the state Supreme Court and was rejected, because at least one of the states would be a Republican stronghold and another one would become a swing state. Basically, it's south, east, and north. South, west, and north Californias. The northern one being kind of rural but having some major Democrat cities in it would be a swing state. West being like Los Angeles and San Francisco would be a Democrat stronghold, whereas south would be mostly rural, and this would be like southeast and south would be like a Democrat stronghold, or at least something very similar to Arizona and Nevada in terms of voting population, which again could be a swing state, but well, we don't really know since this proposal was not even allowed to be voted on. This means that a lot of people who were dissatisfied in California, who wanted these proposals to be passed, decided to just straight up leave. Now, not everyone who leaves California is a Democrat. A lot of them are actually Republicans or centrists who will vote for one party or the other. These people have been moving to states throughout the country. Now, the major quote from the Democrats is that all these people were actually Democrat voters and that they would slowly turn these states into Democrat strongholds. Well, that hasn't been the case. The second plan of the Democrats was to bring in illegal immigrants. Now, back when Reagan was actually in charge of California, he had pushed for amnesty, general amnesty for illegal immigrants. And he would eventually get it, I believe, as president. This meant that a lot of people who had been brought in by the Democrat Party as illegal immigrants suddenly were allowed to be able to become citizens. And then they would get the right to vote. And this is what turned California into a Democrat stronghold, because a lot of these people were beholden by the Democrats, having to rely on the government paycheck to keep them alive. Same with what happened with the black population. And also, well, it's just caused a whole bunch of issues in general. However, with the mass exodus of a lot of people from these Democrat strongholds going to red states, mostly red states, but they have gone to cities and states all over the country, meaning that as time goes on, when the census comes around, a lot of these Democrats states lose a lot of their representatives. That's why a lot of illegal immigrants are brought in to keep the population of these states topped off. However, with all these people being deported now, all these states are losing mass amounts of people. However, the Democrat cities throughout these states are trying to keep these people in by becoming sanctuary cities, meaning that the populations of these cities are not being um, lowered by ICE coming in and working with the local police and making sure that these illegal immigrants are taken out. Since illegal immigrants are counted in the census for one reason or another, the amount that the populations are decreasing is not very quick. However, during the 2020 election, this actually caused a huge upset because, well, Democrat strongholds like New York and California and few other states lost representatives. This included Michigan, which, while being a swing state, has had a population hovering around 10 million and has decreased a little bit and has not really recovered, but it is not increasing in population despite how much open space there is, which is upsetting to me. We used to have 16 representatives, now we only have 13. Anyways, besides the point, this is a huge problem for the Democrats because now they have started to work on a new project. Now, Project 2025 was actually made by an organization completely unrelated to Trump. In fact, Trump disagrees with a lot of the policies in Project 2025. These policies are always, these kinds of projects are always set up and basically are supposed to be given to any generic Republican president in order to convince him to try to enact some of these policies. Well, when Trump complained about it, the CEO in charge of the company that came up with the project ended up getting fired. Not that that was good enough for Democrats. They still pushed the propaganda that Project 2025 was actually Trump's plan, despite it not being. However, to add to the Democrat hypocrisy, they have now come up with a new project called Project 2029. And it's basically to try to give illegal immigrants mass amnesty and protect them from being deported for as long as possible, going against Trump at every step of the way, and try to win the 2028 election. And then when these policies are passed, make sure that the Democrat strongholds throughout the country, including California, do not lose a mass amount of population. Basically, that now that the Democratic Party is becoming more of a Democratic Socialist Party with very hardcore socialist actors inside of it, they have wanted to push toward being more progressive, being more crazy, being more resistant against common sense policies being pushed by Trump, because they have to push against Trump no matter how popular his policies actually are. This is why they have been saying that the Democrats have a 20-80 policy, that they will go with 20% of the population against the majority just to try to hurt Trump as much as possible, which has dropped Democrat favorability down to like 25% now. It's more like around 25 to 30%. It was at 27 last I heard. It's as low as it got. And again, to add the Democrat hypocrisy, with this 2029 proposal, they're trying to prevent, they're trying to fight Trump every step of the way, even for the policies that are so important. Policies that they actually supported 20 years ago before Trump took them for his own. However, this is why the 2028 election is so important, because if someone like J.D. Vance wins, or Vivek Ramaswamy, or anybody in the MAGA camp, they can prevent these policies from being enacted and continue to support people. Now, one of the major issues for the Democrats, again, is that the census seems to have been wrong in 2020. The way they counted it, states like Vermont ended up having way higher populations than they actually do. Now that they have readjusted the counting measures and maybe even will push to not count illegal immigrants in the census, that's unlikely, but it is possible. It is likely that the populations of these Democrat strongholds will decrease massively by 2030. And this is the greatest fear of the Democrats, that if these states' populations continue to decrease and they're actually counted correctly this time around, the amount of representatives the Democrats will lose will ensure that they will not be able to control the House of Representatives as easily as they used to. And they'll have to gerrymander their states in order to ensure that as many of the districts are Democrat as possible, which is very difficult because the Supreme Court, being controlled by Republicans, could step in, as well as other federal courts and local courts, to ensure that this gerrymandering is not allowed to happen. It is a huge problem for the Democrats, and they're going to end up losing a lot of power and control, which, given how crazy they have gotten and how socialist they have gotten, this is probably the best option. However, again, I do not trust the Republicans. Being the bunch of rhinos that they are, they will also push for policies that people just don't agree with. And sometimes they can be warmongers, but, well, given Obama's tendency to use drone strikes, he wasn't that much of a peace-loving hippie either. Not that I agree with the peace-loving hippies, as being a member of the military, but they're cause different issues, which I'm not going to bring up here. But anyways, I think that's all I really wanted to talk about tonight, so I'll leave it there, guys. Talk to you later. Bye.